Well, thank you, Jim, and thank you all for braving the ice. It was a lot warmer down where I live, 8 miles north of the Mason-Dixon, so I'm almost in the south. And as I'm driving up here, I see the temperature going down, down, down. Then a little snowflake icon came on the dashboard. So I appreciate you all braving the ice and coming out to hear me talk about probably my favorite thing ever, which is the rifle musket and how it was used in that span of years that encompassed the American Civil War. So you'll notice here, this isn't tactical influence of the musket in the Civil War, but I've expanded it over the entire era where these weapons were the primary infantry weapon. So from the late 1840s until the mid-1860s. Let's see if this works. So it's always good just to define our terms and start off with what is a rifled musket. So for 200 years before the 1840s, the armies of Europe are armed with a standard weapon, and that is a smoothbore musket. And the only change that happened in that span of 200 years is the ignition of the musket changed from a flintlock to a percussion. It made the ignition more reliable, but it still remained a smoothbore musket. And in the 1840s, with new developments in the ammunition, the rifled musket appeared, which increased the range that a soldier could fire his weapon about 3 times from before without making it any more difficult to load. So the soldier could still load, ram the bullet down, everything he did with the smoothbore musket just as fast, but now the rifling grooves in the barrel will spin the bullet, and it makes your bullet follow a predictable path. That means you can put sights on the gun, and now you can actually aim the rifle at something and possibly hit it. So in theory, it increases the range about 3 times with trained soldiers. And it's interesting, these weapons, the rifle musket, was only really in service around the world for a maximum span of 15 years. So from about 1850 until 1866. And of those years when the armies were fully armed with them and this was the standard weapon, it's even shorter, maybe 7 or 8 years. And it's a coincidence, it's maybe ironic that the American Civil War falls right smack in the middle of this period where this is the cutting edge modern infantry weapon in the world. And those are Austrian troops right before the Austro-Prussian War in 1866, still armed with the rifle musket. They're about to get trounced by the Prussians who have a breech loader. But the rifle musket remains, both then and now, fairly controversial over what it did, what it influenced, whether it changed tactics or not, whether it made the American Civil War longer or bloodier or not. And this is particularly controversial here in the United States because we've kind of made the Civil War our war, and we assume American soldiers in the Civil War had rifles. Therefore, if they had rifles, they would have used them really, really well. The Europeans don't get hung up on the controversy too much. They've come to understand this was an imperfect transitional weapon, but here in the United States, it's still very controversial. What it was, without any controversy, was the first general issue weapon that went out to the ordinary soldier in the modern era that required the soldier to be specifically trained up on it in order to use it effectively. If you hand a smoothbore musket to a new recruit in, let's just say, 1835, you can teach him to pour the gunpowder in, put the bullet in, ram it down, and then wait for the officer to say, present and fire. You can teach him that in about 8 minutes because the fire is not aimed. The smoothbore musket, the bullet bounces down the barrel, and where it goes is where it goes. It's effective to about 100 yards. But a rifle, now that the bullet follows a predictable path, the only way you're going to get any advantage out of having rifled weapons is you have to train your soldiers. And because of the difficulty of training soldiers to use this weapon, historians have been debating how much it influenced things almost since the smoke cleared from Appomattox. We've been arguing about this. And the question is, was it more a rifle or was it more a musket? So starting out before the rifle-musket era, so think 1700s, 1800s, the first half of the 19th century before the American Civil War, there's what we could broadly call the Napoleonic paradigm. So for this 200-year era, the infantry are armed with two weapons. You've got that smoothbore musket, and then you have this handy little bayonet that you can fix on the muzzle. And I didn't bring one here. I'm not going to tempt fate taking a bayonet and a musket to a college. But that musket and the bayonet complemented each other in the Napoleonic paradigm. The reason for that is you've got a musket. Soldiers have a gun, but it's really only good out to about 100 yards. And so if you're approaching an enemy formation, you can fire at them once they're within 100 yards, but they're probably going to get close enough to stab you with the bayonet before you can load a second round. So the bayonet and the musket went hand in hand, and the two complemented each other. And it's a stretch to wrap our minds around, but the bayonet was the decisive weapon under the Napoleonic paradigm, very broadly Napoleonic paradigm. Because fire alone, under the old pre-rifle paradigm, just infantry shooting smoothbore muskets at other infantry was not sufficient. The firepower volumes you generated weren't enough to force the enemy to realize, okay, we're being shot to pieces, we need to fall back and retreat. So the bayonet went hand in hand with the musket. And it's maybe ironic that in this talk on rifle muskets, we're starting off with the bayonet, but to understand the tactical influence of the rifle musket, we have to go back here. So this might be a typical bayonet charge, and everything here has been thought through, including the clothing, the colors, the bright, vibrant colors. You want intimidating, frightening looking colors. So you put all the red plumes in the hats, and then the enemy could recognize, oh, that's that particular unit. They're feared. They're coming at me. And when this group is charging at you and you have a smoothbore musket and you have only one shot, there's a very strong psychological urge not to stand there and wait for them to reach you. So these tactics are generally called shock tactics. And we can often anachronistically make the assumption that they must have been really stupid back then to still keep fighting with the bayonet, even after they had guns. Because why do you want to put a bayonet on your gun and go run and stab someone when you can just stand back and shoot them? But they were not stupid in the 18th and 19th centuries. They knew exactly what they were doing. But the tactics that they developed weren't ignorant of human psychology, because you've only got one shot, and there is an instinctive human aversion to sharp and pointy things, broken glass, knives. That's instinctive. Horses have the same instinct. Horses will not charge into a wall of bayonets. That's why forming an infantry square was so effective. Human beings can rationally understand that if someone is shooting bullets at me, I am in danger, but you can't see the bullets while you can see the blades. So in a typical pre-rifle musket and even post-rifle musket battle, you would shape the engagement with musketry. So you would maneuver your forces around so that you could fire a volley or two into the enemy, and when you sensed the right moment, when you saw the enemy taking some losses from your fire and you think, this is the right moment, maybe I have some numerical superiority, that's when you launch this bayonet attack. And if you're a soldier on the receiving end and you're standing there and you're trying to load your musket, and you look up and there's 5,000 guys shouting "Vive l'Empereur," and they're stamping, keeping march, and they're coming at you with long 20-inch bayonets that are gleamingly polished in all their bright uniforms. It takes the most disciplined soldier to stand there and level his own bayonet and go bayonet to bayonet. So long story short, the bayonet is a powerful psychological weapon that almost never caused any casualties because no one hung around long enough to wait for them to get to them to stab them with the bayonet. And there is an excellent quote from General Napier, who was responding to a critic of the bayonet, and he says, and he was the veteran of the Peninsula War, and there's a statue of him on Trafalgar Square for his services in the Peninsula. But he says, many people will stand fire. So they'll stand there and allow themselves to be shot at for a long time, but they will not stand a charge. So long story short, the takeaway from this is musket fire alone isn't enough to decisively beat the enemy. At some point, you got to put your bayonet on, you got to charge, you got to drive the enemy off the position, and that is considered decisive. And by the way, this system worked great for 200 years. Napoleon, with his small columns, conquered Europe with this system, with the bayonet. The musketry caused all the wounds, but the bayonet is what actually drove the enemy off their position, and it worked great. Everyone was happy and having a great old time until... That is someone you might have heard of. If you've heard of the mini ball from the Civil War, the most common bullet of the Civil War, that's the guy who invented the first version of that, Claude-Étienne Minier. And in the late 1840s, he discovers that if you hollow out the back of a bullet and still make it small enough to load down the barrel, the explosion of the gunpowder will open up that bullet, force it to expand, and it will grip the rifling, and so it will come out the barrel fitting tightly and the bullet will spin. But you can load this gun as quickly as you can a smoothbore musket. And he comes along, he improves on some earlier designs, Delville, Tamige, Touvenant, but Minier was the real breakthrough because his gun can load and fire as fast as the smoothbore musket. And by accuracy, it's now possible to shoot and hit a target 300 yards, 400 yards, 500 yards, even the sights on this rifle that I brought here, this is a pattern 1851 Minier rifle, so it is 170, I'm a history major, so I don't do math. It's 174 years old, and the sights on that go to 1,000 yards. Very optimistic 1,000 yards, but it is theoretically possible now for a soldier, a trained soldier, to shoot that far. Of course, Minier becomes a household name overnight. We've probably all heard of the mini ball, and everyone quickly adopts this new weapon, except for Prussia. They already had a breech-loading rifle, but everyone in the 1850s, by 1860, every single major power in Europe and the United States was armed with the Minier rifle. But now that there's a new weapon with new capabilities, there's no agreement on how we're actually going to use this thing and how we're going to update our tactics to use it. So there's a debate that starts, and it rages all through the 1850s into the 1860s, because the rifle-musket gives you an advantage. You now have a soldier that can hit a target at 400, 500, 600 yards. But the only way they can do that is to intensively train them. So keep in mind, in Europe, in the 1850s, 1860s, the armies are early industrial, early modern, so they're conscript-based. For the privilege of being born in that country, you get to go serve in the king's army for a period of years. And the soldiers that are conscripted, they're fairly low quality, and they only serve in the active army for a short term. Then they go get shuffled off into the reserves, and then the next generation of 18, 19-year-olds come in. And it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to take a conscript who's only going to be in your army for 2 years and spend all the time and energy and money to train them to use a rifle that requires a great deal of skill in order to shoot. And if you give the rifle to someone who doesn't have this training, it doesn't give you any advantage. It's really going to be no better than the old smoothbore musket if that soldier doesn't know how to use it. So for the rifle to be any good, for you to unlock this amazing capability of being able to hit things at 3 or 4 or 5 times the range of the old smoothbore musket, you have to train the soldiers extensively. And I put a note on here. Rifle muskets are much harder to use than modern rifles because of the slow velocity of the bullet. So the bullet out of these rifles was shooting much slower than bullets out of pistols today, to kind of put it in perspective, between 800 and about 1,000 feet per second. So what these soldiers are doing here, these were soldiers going through the British Army School of Musketry at Hythe, which was in southern England on the seashore, and they're doing something called the aiming drill. So they would set their rifles on these sandbags and they would aim at a target, and once they've locked in their aim, they stepped away and the instructor would come up behind and look and verify that they correctly aimed. So they're teaching soldiers how to use the sights of a weapon, and they wouldn't have had to do that with the old smoothbore musket. And this is a great quote from William Napier's brother, and we chuckle at this today, but in 1853 he's saying everyone's going to have these new Minier rifles, and that means we're not going to be able to get close enough to each other. They're going to be picking off the generals, and if we have to spread out and be farther away and we're shooting back and forth at 1,000 yards, no one's going to be able to charge in with the bayonet, and therefore the battle is not going to be decisive. We're just going to stand hundreds of yards away from each other and shoot back and forth and waste a whole bunch of ammunition, and nothing is going to happen. And we kind of chuckle at this now, but he made a point, and we'll circle back to this a little bit later when we get to the American Civil War, because a lot of what he described here actually ended up happening in the American Civil War. And in spite of General Napier, and in spite of a lot of other old fogies who didn't want to embrace new technology, the British Army, uniquely among all the countries in Europe, decide to adopt firepower as their primary mode of infantry combat. So almost exclusively, we're going to defeat the enemy now. We have a rifle. We're going to defeat the enemy using these rifles by shooting bullets at them. And the bayonet might be a last resort backup, or it might help us for the final push. But we will, now that we have these weapons, we will defeat the enemy using firepower. And they can do that because the British Army was the only army in Europe, major army, that was not conscript-based at this time. So you volunteered for the British Army, and it would stay that way until 1915 when they finally started drafting soldiers for World War I. But in the 1850s and 1860s, you volunteered for the British Army, and you signed up for life, usually 16 years, which was essentially life, given the life expectancy in the 1850s. But you're in the Army, which means you have sergeants who've been in the Army now for 10 or 12 years, and you have this long-term institutional knowledge. So the British realize we have an amazing thing here. We are willing to spend the money to train our soldiers how to shoot because they're going to stay in the Army for a long time. So they open up the School of Musketry you saw on a couple slides before, where they were teaching the soldiers how to use their sights, and they run them through an extensive training process. And this pays off for the British because early in the Rifle-Musket's service life, they end up going to war. They go to war with Russia in 1854, the Crimean War, which is most famously known for the Charge of the Light Brigade, into the Valley of Death, rode the 600. But if you've ever heard the phrase, the thin red line, that was also from the Crimean War. That's what this painting is. That's the 93rd Highlanders, and they were charged by Russian cavalry, and they had no support. They're just infantry out in this valley at Balaclava, the same day as the Charge of the Light Brigade. This is the same battle. And the Russian cavalry saw them there, and they thought, there's unsupported infantry by themselves. They've got muskets. We can gallop on them, and yeah, they'll get one volley off, and then we'll be on them, and they're not going to really be able to do much with one volley. So the Russian cavalry advanced, and the British opened fire with these rifles, the pattern 1851 Minier rifle. they start firing at 600 yards. And long story short, the Russian cavalry never made it. They didn't make it within 150 yards. And these were trained British professional infantry. Later on, a couple years later, they fought the Indian Rebellion. It was not much smaller than the American Civil War in size. It was the largest rebellion against British colonial rule ever. It took the British 2 years to put down the Indian Rebellion because the Sepoy Army revolted, the largest standing army in the world. The East India Company Army revolted. The British Army had to go put it down, and they also used rifles to great effect there. So they've understood, I'll go to the next slide, that we can train soldiers to use this weapon effectively. It just takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of money. So these are some of the books of instruction, some of the things that the soldiers would be taught. It was not a short course because these are very difficult weapons. They're much harder than modern rifles to shoot. And if you are interested in more of the specifics, I have some of the original training manuals here. There's a lot more than this. There's page after page of graphs and diagrams and step-by-step instructions. But the British Army was training soldiers in the 1850s and through the 1860s. They fired an annual rifle practice. Each soldier fired 90 rounds of ammunition, and they fired at ranges out to 900 yards. So 90 rounds per man, and they're firing at 900 yards. And to put it in context, until very recently, the U.S. Army's annual rifle qualification was 58 rounds out to 300 meters. So the British Army in 1859 is almost firing twice as many rounds annually and at 3 times the range that the U.S. Army is firing our qualification today. Problem is it's super, super expensive. So ammunition is handmade. And since I do this for a living, I can attest it takes a lot of dexterity and time to roll up little cylinders of paper, and children made them in both the British Army and the United States Army, for which they were very well paid. The children who made the ammunition were paid more than the soldiers shooting it, ironically. But ammunition is expensive, it's very heavy, and there's never enough of it. But the British Army said, we're going to spend the money, we're going to cough up the cash to establish these schools to train our soldiers. And almost all the powers of Europe adopt these schools of musketry. So you've got the British, French, even the Italians. Italy didn't exist until 1860, and they had a school of musketry. No such school or program existed in the United States. So we'll circle back to the Americans here shortly. But these schools taught soldiers the same basic fundamentals of rifle shooting that we teach soldiers today. So if you've ever shot rifle, you know you got to control your breathing, you got to know how to line up your sights, you have to work carefully on your trigger squeeze, because if you jerk the trigger, you're not going to fire accurately. They're teaching all of these things, but there's one other absolutely crucial skill that they have to teach soldiers in the rifle-musket era, and that's what they're doing here. These soldiers are doing judging distance drill, because you have to know exactly how far away your enemy is or you're going to miss him. So this slide probably looks complicated. Ignore the math. All the takeaway here is that the rifle musket shoots a bullet that moves so slow that if you want to hit anything more than 200 yards away, you have to use the sights on the rifle, which elevate, and you look down the sights, and you have to elevate your barrel so that the bullet shoots up and then it comes down. So think, instead of shooting like a straight line, think almost like you're throwing a basketball, because the bullets are going so slow. If we want to shoot farther away, we have to aim the barrel up and launch them on this parabolic trajectory. That means if your enemy is 300 yards away, and you look at him standing out there and you say, I think he's 250 yards away, and you set your sights at 250 yards, you'll miss him. Even if you do everything else right. So if your breathing is right, your trigger squeeze is right, your aim is absolutely perfect, but your sights are off by 50 or 100 yards, it is a mathematical certainty that you are going to miss. So here, for instance, the enemy soldier is standing at 300 yards. And on the top, that's what the bullet does if you set your sights for 400 yards, so one notch above 300. If you misjudge the distance by just 100 yards, the bullet flies over his head. And if you misjudge the distance the other way, if you bring it down to 200 yards, the bullet lands about 50 feet in front of him. Sometimes it'll bounce up and ricochet into the target very spectacularly, as Joe knows. But you can't count on that. So even being off just by one notch on your sight, your fire, it's a mathematical certainty you are going to miss. So you have to do everything right. Not only all the breathing, the trigger squeeze, the aiming, but you also have to precisely set the sights within 30, 40, 50 yards of where the enemy actually is, or you are going to miss every single time. So there's a brief honeymoon period shortly after Claude Meunier comes up with his new rifle musket, and then everyone is initially intrigued, like, oh wow, now we can aim and shoot at long distances. By the 1855, 1856, everyone kind of calms down because they realize we're never going to actually train that common soldier well enough to be able to estimate that distance that precisely. So there's a lock on the capability of the rifle musket. It can shoot out to long range, but to unlock that capability and get soldiers that can actually do it takes way more resources than what we're willing to do. And by and large, Europe agrees it's really not worth training these conscript soldiers. So they kind of they revert back. And by the way, do they look familiar in that picture? Those are French troops at their training camp at Chalon, which was public, because they wanted everyone to come to this training camp and be impressed with how good the French army was. But the uniform styles look very, very familiar. We'll circle back to that. The French model contrasted with the British decided, yeah, we are actually going to pony up the money. We're going to spend the money and the resources to train all of our soldiers to be marksmen in our small volunteer army. The French, on the other hand, say, no, we're going to split the difference. We're going to take like the elite troops that are going to stay in the army longer. Think like the Zouaves, the chasseurs, the elite units of the French army. We will actually spend the money and time to train them how to shoot. Everyone else, we're still going to give them a rifle, but they're only going to have one sight on it, one notch sight, and it's good out to a maximum of 300 yards, because the theory is we're never going to end up training them to be able to shoot this thing any farther than that anyway. So we get these new French tactics, which McClellan called the French army the most complete infantry that Europe can produce, because he went to Europe in 1856 as part of the Delafield Commission to observe the Crimean War, and McClellan already, even before he went to France, he was already obsessed with the French. He would translate the French bayonet manual. That was the U.S. Army's bayonet manual in the Civil War. But the French tactics were influenced by their campaign in North Africa, where they had to fight shadowy Algerian tribesmen, and blasting them with volleys of smoothbore muskets just wasn't very effective. So they realized the rifle can be really useful in this context. And again, they divided their army between the heavy line infantry. So these are the conscripts who were not really going to spend a whole lot of time training to shoot. And then there's the elite special units that we do train to shoot, units like the chasseur, which is the French for hunter. they get the rifle. So the chasseurs à pied are the elite special forces of the day. They were supposed to be expert at everything. So they can fight in the line like regular infantry. They can scatter out and fight at skirmishers. And they're really well trained on the bayonet, and they're also really well trained on the rifle. And the French, again, the honeymoon period with the rifle has ended, and the French, the pendulum has kind of swung back that even though there's rifles and they're out there, they exist on the battlefield, we still believe that the bayonet can still overcome the firepower of the new rifles on the battlefield. And they're assuming, you know, if we're having a hard time training the average soldier to shoot accurately at long range, everyone else is having the same problem. So we can probably still stick with our bayonet-centered tactics. So again, we'll shape the battle by shooting at the enemy, and then at the right moment, we charge with the bayonet. That can still be an effective tactic. And the élan, the moral and psychological force of that bayonet attack was perceived to be stronger than bullets. Napoleon III is telling his troops that these new rifles are only dangerous to you at a distance. So therefore, you need to cross that dangerous space quickly. And in order to do that, the French, the pas gymnastique, which the French Foreign Legion still does. They will still go do parades with this, where it is a march at a pace of 150 steps per minute. So it's basically a run in step that's very fast. And they trained on this to quickly cross that dangerous space so the enemy can't shoot their rifles at us. And we get close enough to them and the enemy will see us coming. When they would stamp the pas gymnastique, the ground would shake. It's almost like when when 3,000 guys are coming at you and they're stamping on the ground shakes. And it would take the most disciplined soldiers to stand there and receive that charge bayonet to bayonet. Now, unfortunately, there hasn't been a war in Europe since 1815. And everyone's sitting around theorizing, and those are the chasseurs, they're doing the pas gymnastique there in that painting. But everyone's like wondering, how is the next war actually going to be? Because there hasn't been a war in Europe since Napoleon, but finally, conveniently, there is the first European war since 1815. It's a war over Italy. Northern Italy was part of the Austrian Empire, and Napoleon III and the French wanted to wrest northern Italy away from Austria, so we have the War of 1859, or the Second War of Italian Independence. And in this war, long story short, two first-rate empires, the French Empire and the Austrian Empire. This is the last war where the kings, the emperors of both sides, personally led their soldiers in battle. And it happens in northern Italy, which is a flat plain. So if there's ever a place like a test bed for the rifle musket, it's a nice flat open area, an open battlefield. And it's a bunch of clumsy battles, major battles at Solferino and Magenta. The casualties are so catastrophic that the Red Cross is born as a result of the Battle of Solferino. But the French win, and both sides were armed at least partially with the new rifle musket. The French not only won, but their chasseurs, their highly trained jack-of-all-trades soldiers, assaulted Austrian positions, including Austrian artillery, and captured them without firing a shot. They did it all with the bayonet. So the takeaway for Europe and everyone, even the United States, is, wow, there's finally been a major war, first-rate empires. This isn't a colonial dispute. This isn't the Turks and Russians fighting in some backwater. This is European Western powers. And the rifle musket, the new Austrian rifle musket, failed to stop the French bayonet attacks. At least that was the takeaway that Europe took away. So shock won. Fire didn't win. The shock, the bayonet, the aggressive shock tactics won. And so in 1859, going into 1860, this is what the world thinks. This is the latest and greatest for war. So December 1860, when South Carolina secedes, this is what everyone thinks war will look like. This is the future. We're still charging in and stabbing people with bayonets if they don't run away from us first. So across the pond, finally we get to the United States. What do we got? And not much. So in 1860, the entire United States Army was 16,000 troops. So to put that into perspective, the army of the Dukedom of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, which is a tiny North German dukedom the size of Connecticut, had an army twice as big. So we have a tiny, tiny, tiny army. And this tiny, tiny army, our tactical manuals are copies of the French. And by copies, literal, almost word for word, verbatim copies of the French manuals. Because again, the French are really cool. They're the ones with the chasseurs. They're fighting in North Africa. There's this Zouave craze. They're the ones who know war really well. So we just copy what they do, including their uniforms, really spiffy looking kepis, which is the most stupid piece of military headgear. But we copy it. And we had two systems of tactics that were both translations of the French. We had Scott's tactics, which was a translation of 1831 French tactics. And then we have Hardee's, which was a translation of an 1845 French manual. And so we finally get to Hardee. Doesn't that uniform look familiar? That's right out of Hardee's tactics. We were copying the French right down to the rifle. So Hardee's tactics was the primary manual of infantry tactics used during the American Civil War. Hardee was a lieutenant in the 1850s. He was asked to translate this French book of tactics, and so by the time the Civil War starts and American soldiers north and south are using this manual, the translation is already 15 years old. The French had actually adopted a subsequent, more advanced manual, but we're still using the older one. And it is Rifle and Light Infantry Tactics, which was intended for specialized troops. This wasn't the manual for the regular line infantry. It later would become that, but as it was written, this was the manual for the special troops, the chasseur type troops that are going to do everything really, really quickly. One thing Hardee does do that is somewhat of an innovation, in this aspect he copied the British. He said, we're getting rid of the distinction between the light infantry, like the chasseurs who can do everything in skirmish, and the line infantry, the guys who just stand there shoulder to shoulder. He says, everyone needs to be able to do both roles in case you're called upon for that. And he also makes one interesting other change. And if you can read the fine text at the bottom left, he increases the pace of that pas gymnastique from 150 steps per minute to 165 steps per minute, because he wants to cross that dangerous space even faster. He wants to get in and drive the enemy off their position with this bayonet charge. And these tactics, these chasseur style tactics, also require intensive training. Hardee ends up becoming a professor at West Point, and the cadets at West Point are his guinea pigs, and he trains them on these new tactics. The West Point cadets called it the Shanghai drill, because it's this high knee run at 165 paces per minute. It was absolutely hated, but this was how we in the United States before the Civil War are imagining we're going to be fighting a war. And you probably already don't need me to tell you that this really isn't what the Civil War combat actually ended up looking like, but this is what we thought war was going to end up looking like. So in the United States, before the Civil War, we adopted a new system of rifle weapons. And were you here last month, Joe? Was that?
That was 3 months ago.
Yeah, last month was even me.
Yeah, I was about 3 months ago.
3 months ago? Well, when Joe did his presentation a few months ago, if you were here for that, he brought his immaculate Model 1855 rifle musket, which was one of the system of new weapons that the United States adopts in 1855. But bear in mind, we don't have any of those schools that Europe had. And there's kind of no point because we have an army of 16,000 troops and they're scattered all over the place. Most of them are out west. The US Army was more of like a frontier police force at this point. And then we thought if we ever have to go to war, then the state volunteer militias will rise up. We still have this American suspicion of standing armies, even at this point. So the theory is, if someone wants to come across the Atlantic and fight us, we'll call up our militia and we'll drive them off like we did twice before in the Revolution in 1812. But we did think, we probably actually should have a manual for target shooting. So they selected Harry Heath, who was probably better known as the guy who inadvertently starts the Battle of Gettysburg. And in the movie Gettysburg, they do him a real, he's like, the situation's very confused. They make him look like a fool. He's actually a very, very smart, intelligent man. And he translated the French rifle instruction manual to English, and that became the US Army's system of rifle instruction. And he even complains here in the lower right, he said, I would have absolutely copied word for word the French system if we had service schools of instruction similar to theirs. So he says, I don't claim to have made up anything new. This is just a copy, the best I can do, of the French, and we really can't even implement this because we don't even have the school. But this was the system in place for training American soldiers in target practice before the Civil War, and it was completely ignored, absolutely ignored. Now bear in mind, in the 1850s up until 1860, if you're a captain in the US Army, you're a captain of infantry in 1860, you've probably been in the Army at least 15 years, maybe even longer, because promotions were abysmally slow. So you might be a captain in 1860, but when you went to West Point in 1846, no one had ever heard of Claude Meunier. No one had anticipated infantry firefights are going to be at long range. And you just saw what happened in Italy in 1859, where the French won without relying on long range fire. So they were very skeptical of these new rifles training at long range. We're more comfortable with the old system. And Hardy's chasseur style tactics, that's 165 paces per minute, had been vindicated by the war in Italy. And we weren't expecting in 1860 to have to fight a war where infantry firepower was going to be the decisive aspect of that war. There's a couple of young officers who do appreciate the rifle musket. Does anyone recognize who that is? It's a very young Cadmus Wilcox, who was one of Lee's best combat commanders during the Civil War. He goes to Europe in the 1850s, realizes what they're doing over there, and becomes a advocate of the rifle musket. If you're interested, I do have his book. This is Wilcox's book if you want to look at it afterwards. But he comes back and says, hey guys, look at all the stuff that they're doing over there in Europe. Keep in mind this is 1857, this is before the War of 1859. But he's making predictions. He says, in the future, if you've got two sides armed with rifles, their fire is going to be irresistible at 600 yards. So these trained soldiers are going to be able to take out the enemy with irresistible fire at 600 yards. And he's saying, we're not going to be able to stand shoulder to shoulder anymore and fight in closed ranks like we're used to. If everyone has rifles, we're going to have to spread out. And if we spread out, he's thinking ahead here. He says, new tactical means will be required, but he doesn't know what they are because these ideas of small unit leadership, like NCOs leading squads, doesn't exist. But he's thinking through, if this is what war is going to look like with rifles, we're going to have to come up with a new way to command and control these soldiers. And again, he's imagining this, a war scenario very much like 1859, where you've got these fast-moving chasseur-style troops, which didn't end up happening. But finally, so war declared. And what we see in the first few months of 1861 up until the end of 1861 is a explosion in the size of the United States and Confederate States Army. So we go from a nucleus of 16,000 soldiers in an army, and it explodes to 500,000 soldiers within 6 months. Because these are all the volunteers, enthusiastic volunteers, rising up, volunteering for the army. And in context, the Battle of Shiloh, which was fairly early, April 1862, so still quite early in the war, there were 24,000 casualties at Shiloh. So there were many more casualties in this one battle than there were soldiers in the entire United States Army a year ago. And when the armies explode to this size, there's not enough of anything. There's not enough guns, there's not enough equipment. So we kind of panic, and we have to go to Europe to buy anything the Europeans will sell us. And by us, North and South both sent purchasing agents to Europe, and they're buying, give us anything that will shoot. And so the obsolete stacks of guns in Europe get sold off and shipped over here to the United States. And that is why it is harder to find a British model or pattern 1851 Minier rifle in England, where they were made and served. It's hard to find them in England because they were all sent here for the American Civil War. And now, ironically, it's a scarce rifle, but you can find them more often here than you can in England, because all these obsolete guns got shipped over. The Prussians sent observers over, and they're watching this very closely, and they don't even know what to say about the American armies. So you have this cobbled together army of enthusiastic volunteers who have no idea what they're doing, and they're writing home and they're saying, these are distant and alien circumstances to what we are used to in a professional army. But eventually, most soldiers in the American Civil War, by 1862, especially 1863 in the North, and to a large extent in the South as well, most soldiers in the American Civil War eventually were armed with the rifle-musket. So they got the gun, they have the rifle. What they never got was the training, either for the men or for the officers. So that capability, the ability of trained troops to fire and accurately engage targets at long range, was never unlocked during the American Civil War, because we just didn't have the capability to train up an army to do that. The vast majority of Civil War soldiers and officers didn't know much about military marksmanship. They were, look at, what was Chamberlain? He was a professor, right, in Maine, and he was buddies with the governor. Next thing you know, he's a colonel. And there was a phrase that Civil War generals often went into battle with the sword in one hand and Jean Monet's book, The Art of War, in the other, because they're literally like learning how to do war while they're doing it. So the war is fighting now. You fight the war with the army you have, not the army you wish you have. And we fought it with a volunteer, basically a militia army. General Gibbon, who commanded the famous Black Hat Brigade, we could say that's probably one of the most combat effective, expert, veteran units of the American Civil War. He said, after the Civil War, he said, beyond 150 yards, it's just a matter of chance. So we're not even really going to shoot at those kind of ranges. And they get asked a lot, well, we can get the Europeans not knowing anything about shooting because they're Europeans and they didn't grow up around guns. But here in America, we grew up and 12-year-old Tommy's shooting a squirrel to go put in the pot for dinner. So all these Americans really, really know how to shoot. And if, for sake of argument, we accept that that's true, if we just say, yes, every single Civil War soldier was familiar with firearms, if we accept that, which they almost certainly were not, especially the ones from the cities in the north, and especially all the immigrants who came over, the Germans, the Irish, never touched a gun until they entered the Civil War. But if for sake of argument we say, okay, we'll concede that they might have known how to shoot a squirrel rifle, there's a world of difference shooting something 25 feet away or a deer 50, 100 feet away, as opposed to shooting a column of enemy troops who are shooting back at you and they are 300, 400 yards away. Because if you're a civilian shooter, you don't have to estimate the distance. You just point and shoot and you're close enough that it makes no difference. So the civilian marksmanship that many Civil War soldiers would have come into the Army with wouldn't have translated into effective military marksmanship. And this kind of strikes home for me too, because I joined the Army after I had already been shooting on my own at the range for years and years. I thought I was a good shot. I joined the Army, and that was the first time I ever shot at anything more than 100 yards away. And I had no idea what I was doing. The Army had to teach me. And the British, who had that trained volunteer army, they look at what's going on in the Civil War and they say, wow, there's been a comparatively slight effect on the conduct of the war. So much so that the rifle made so little difference that in many cases the old smoothbore musket was still relevant. And in the North and the South, many units didn't want to give up their old smoothbore muskets. They wanted to keep them because at short range you could fire a type of ammunition called buck and ball, where you have one heavy round ball and then 3 pieces of buckshot. So it turns the gun into a form of shotgun. So every shot you're shooting 4 projectiles instead of 1. And at close range, at 100 yards or less, this is absolutely devastating. So late into the war, we see units wanting to keep their smoothbore muskets. They don't want to get a new rifle. In December 1862, the commander of the 11th New Jersey says the musket with buck and ball is the best arm in the service. And we see here the monument at Gettysburg on Cemetery Ridge of the 12th New Jersey. And they were on Cemetery Hill July 3rd, Pickett's charge comes, and they were about 100 yards away from the Emmitsburg Road. And there's their monument on the left. They were formed up here, and when the rebels crossed the Emmitsburg Road, that's when they opened up with their buck and ball, and it was incredibly effective fire. But this is July 1863, and soldiers with the old smoothbore musket are still very, very effective because no one's firing at longer distances. Even further down Cemetery Ridge, the Union troops there didn't open fire with their rifles until the Confederates were crossing the Emmitsburg Road, so no more than 200 yards away. And if there was ever a time that Civil War soldiers could have used the long-range capability of their rifles, it's when all these multiple divisions of Confederate troops are slowly walking towards them in line. They just didn't know how, so they held their fire until the Confederates basically got up on them. So the reality was the troops of the Civil War, we can paint with a broad brush, they were armed with the rifle musket, but they used them as though they were smoothbores. So the effect of the rifle musket, the capability that it had, was squandered. There were some efforts to train the soldiers to actually use these weapons more to their capability. Perhaps the most famous was General Cleburne, who was a division commander in the Army of Tennessee. Ironically, he's in Hardee's Corps, the same guy who wrote the Chasseur Hardee's Tactics. and in Bragg's Army of the Tennessee. But Patrick Cleburne was Irish, and he had been in the British Army before the Civil War. And so he comes over here. He enlists as a private when the war starts. Enlists as a private, and then everyone soon quickly realizes, holy cow, this guy actually knows stuff about being in the Army. And next thing you know, he's an officer and he becomes a general because he's one of the few people who had that institutional, professional knowledge of professional soldiering. And he remembers from being in the British Army, yeah, we were shooting and we were really, really good. So he tries to train his soldiers, and he's realizing there's a lot of comparisons between the Confederate Army and the British Army in the sense that both of them were smaller than their potential rivals. The British Army was going to be smaller than the French Army that might be invading them. So to even the odds, the British said, we're going to have to train with the rifle so that one British soldier can take out 3 Frenchmen. Cleburne is thinking the same thing. We are going to have to give the Confederate soldier a combat multiplier if we're going to stand up against the much larger numbers and resources coming from the north. So he tries to train his soldiers, and he appoints an officer to write an instruction manual. And I have a copy. This is a reprint. If you want to look at it later, I have a copy of it here. But he copies the British and French manual, and in the very end, he leaves out all the part where you actually go to the range and start practice shooting. He only covers the theoretical because he says the economy necessary in ammunition renders it impossible to practice at the target. So they didn't have any ammunition to actually go out and shoot. So they're training soldiers with theory. So when you go to shoot, this is how you need to use your sights. And the soldiers never really got the chance to go out and actually shoot. On the Union side, as late as 1864, General Meade is realizing a lot of the soldiers in the Army have no idea how to actually load and fire their weapons. And so this is late war. They've been in combat for 3 years. This is a battle-hardened army. And he's still realizing, we've never trained our soldiers how to shoot. So he says every single soldier, by this point they had enough ammo in the north, every single soldier is going to go shoot 10 rounds in front of his officer, and the officer is going to make sure he's doing it right so that they can go into battle and be more effective with their weapons. And again, this is late war. And this is what astonished me when I started researching this topic maybe 10 years ago or so, was a report after the war where the Ordnance Department conducted interviews, and they came to the conclusion that tens of thousands of Union soldiers, at least, never even fired their issued weapon until they were in combat. So they shot their gun for the first time when someone is in combat shooting back at them. So these soldiers who haven't shot their guns before they're in battle, they're not going to have a profound influence. They're not going to have a revolutionary effect on the tactics of the Civil War. So what did the rifle-musket do in the American Civil War? The consensus among historians, and we're fortunate that we still have a lot of the battlefields, and so we know exactly, okay, this regiment was here, the enemy was there, and we have the reports of all these officers saying, we opened fire when the enemy was here. The range among scholars for the average distance of a Civil War firefight is between 90 and about 140 yards. The 140-yard figure is late war. Dr. Hess, in his book on the rifle-musket, he did an excellent job compiling all the late war records. Early war, it was closer to 90. That was Patty Griffith's estimate out of Battle Tactics of the Civil War. But whichever we go, 90 or 140, that's still basically within the range of the old smooth war. Because what was happening is soldiers who did not know how to estimate the distance would simply wait until the enemy got close enough that they didn't need to estimate the distance. They got close enough that we can fire, and we're not going to miss. We're still in the old smoothbore range. So I would say earlier that we fought the Civil War in the Napoleonic way, or that it was the last Napoleonic War. I wouldn't even argue that. I would say eventually the armies, North and South, became very good at fighting a unique style of war. I know the slide says earlier style, but what we were doing in the Civil War wasn't even really Napoleonic. Napoleonic was fast-moving columns, swarms of skirmishers. Napoleon was very good at these small column attacks. What we tended to do was fight with firepower with guns we didn't know how to use. So we stayed in line. The American Civil War was largely fought in line formation, and we marched up to each other and pasted each other at moderate to short ranges, so close that we can't miss. And with the volunteer troops, we weren't really good at following it up with that aggressive bayonet charge. Volunteer troops and militia-style troops don't have that intense discipline that the chasseurs were drilled into to do that follow-through assault. So we ended up fighting battle after battle. The Europeans are watching this saying, they're not decisive. These battles the Americans are fighting, these militia battles, are not decisive. And I would argue the rifles didn't bring about trench warfare. Many more eminent historians than me, people with letters after their name who are much smarter than I am, would argue that it did, that the increased accuracy of the rifle musket led to the trench siege warfare we saw later in the war, like Petersburg. But this wasn't the first time that you had entrenchments. The Russians had entrenchments in the Crimea, the siege of Yorktown in the Revolutionary War, there were entrenchments. I would argue the trench warfare phase in the last year of the war was more the result of the Confederates with fewer and lesser men falling back in entrenchments to give themselves as much of an advantage on the defensive as they could. There was one area, though, where the rifle did contribute significantly to the Civil War, and that is in sharpshooting. So this painting, it's a Troyani painting of a barricade that Confederate sharpshooters built right in front of my shop in Gettysburg, so right on Baltimore Street. I open my door and I have that view. That is the Tilly Pierce house in the background. But they occupied the houses, built the barricade in the street, and these soldiers out of Blackford's battalion of Confederate sharpshooters, they're firing on Union troops on Cemetery Hill, which was between 400 and 500 yards away. And again, these are sharpshooters, and they actually are firing at long ranges. So both sides raised and trained dedicated sharpshooter units. So you might have heard of Berdan's sharpshooters. So think of these hand-picked expert rifle shots that get formed into these specialized units. And the sharpshooters are given the ammunition and the training to not only stay proficient, because they only picked the guys that were naturally really good shots, but then they gave them the ammunition on a much smaller scale. We're talking about a fraction of the Army, but they trained and fired at long range. And I would argue units like Major Blackford's Confederate Sharpshooter Battalion, because they did get the training and they got the combat experience. The combination of those two, I would argue they were probably the best soldiers in the world. I would take Major Bradford's Sharpshooter Battalion and put it toe-to-toe with the French Chasseurs or a crack unit in the British Army because they had the same training and they had the actual combat experience. So for soldier, we did have, I would argue, some of the best soldiers in the world. But sharpshooting is annoying. It's not decisive. And I use that word because there's a marker from Howard's 11th Corps on Cemetery Hill that said the fire from the Confederate sharpshooters annoyed them greatly, which I think is the understatement of all time. But it's annoying fire. The sharpshooter fire is going to cause casualties, but it's not going to cause your whole army to drop their guns and run away. So what was then the influence of the rifle musket? So it was a transitional weapon, and by imperfect, it had some of the aspects of a modern weapon in that it's a rifle, but it's imperfect in that it is so stinking hard to use because the muzzle velocity is so low and the rate of fire is so low. So it starts a paradigm shift where it is the first modern weapon. We have to train soldiers how to use this weapon, but it can't complete it. So we will see that paradigm completed where the bayonet truly becomes redundant and unnecessary once you get repeating rifles and machine guns. The bayonet finally goes away. But in the rifle muskets era, bayonet is still a very practical, very effective weapon. It required intensive training of an order of magnitude more than we have to train soldiers today to shoot rifles because it's just such a difficult weapon to shoot accurately. Joe and I and some other friends went out to the range. We fired it at 300 yards, and we've all been shooting a lot. You know, we do this as a hobby. We have a lot more trigger time than Civil War soldiers. And what would you say, maybe 20% of our bullets hit the target? And by the target, I mean it's 6 feet tall and like 8 feet wide. This is a big target. And I like to think we know what we're doing, and even then we can only hit the target 20% of the time. If we had M1 Garands or a modern rifle, no question, we like 90% of the time. So it's a very difficult gun. There's a capability there, but the effort it takes to actually unlock that capability is more than anyone realistically, except for the British, were able to invest. So its tactical influence was very mixed. We see in the American Civil War, its effect was probably insignificant. I might go out on a little bit of a limb here and say the Civil War wouldn't have looked much different if everyone was armed with a smoothbore musket. But in places where soldiers were trained, like we see the British in the Crimea and in India, it was very effective, and they were using it effectively at long range. But one of the takeaways of the rifle musket, and I'll leave with this concept, is that it made what the Germans called Feuertaktik. In English, we would call it fire tactics. It made it possible. So Feuertaktik is where we fight the enemy, we defeat the enemy simply by shooting bullets at them. There's no bayonets involved. And the rifle musket, once soldiers get the rifle musket, now you can start shooting at the enemy at such a longer range. The light bulb goes on, and it's, well, maybe we can defeat the enemy before they even get close enough to us. And this is one of my favorite slides. This is out of Lieutenant Arthur Walker's manual for the British Army School of Musketry. So this is a British manual. This was printed in 1864. So the same year that General Meade with the Army of the Potomac is saying, hey, take the guys out, have them shoot some rounds, make sure they know how to load and fire these guns. This is what the British were doing the same year in their army. So the concept here is that the friendlies are on, what is that, the left? History major, I get my left and right confused. We're over there, and the enemy is up here. You can see kind of like a fortification on the far edge. And that fortification is covering the bridge. So the bridge over this river, that's a narrow choke point. So the enemy has a fortification, and they have soldiers up there that if we try to charge across this bridge, they're going to mow us down like bowling pins. It's an easy choke point. We can't miss. They'll concentrate their fire on us. And if we charge across that bridge, at best, we'll take heavy casualties. At worst, we won't even make it across. So the British start thinking, you know, we have guns now that shoot 900 yards. So what we'll do is we'll split our force in two. We'll have half of our soldiers stay back and fire 900 yards at the enemy position. So when you can fire 3 rounds a minute, and the British Army with the ammunition that they had, better than our ammunition in the Civil War, frankly, you could load and fire 3 rounds a minute. And their ammunition would not foul the guns like our ammunition did in the Civil War. If you have 1,000 soldiers back there, they're firing 3 rounds a minute. I did the math. I think it works out to 66 bullets a second falling on the enemy position. It would take 18 machine guns firing sustained fire at a cyclic rate of 200 or 300 rounds per minute to match that firepower. So if you're a soldier in this little fortification here, and there's 66 bullets every second, a hail of lead, literally, all you can do is hunker down with your head down. And so the British are thinking, well, now we can send our guys, and they're kind of hard to see, but you can see them here. They're leisurely marching over the bridge with their arms on their shoulder, because the enemy is, to use the modern term, the enemy is suppressed. This is fire and maneuver tactics. We start to see this appear in World War I with machine guns, where we're going to shoot at the area the enemy is at. We're not aiming at a particular person. We're just shooting at the area the enemy is at. The enemy will take so much fire that they're forced to hunker down. And while they're hunkered down, taking cover, they're suppressed. They can't move. They can't shoot back. That's when we move on them with our attack force, so we can attack them without taking too many casualties. This is modern tactics, and the British are thinking this through with the rifled muskets. This is 1864. So its influence in Europe is this concept that we can defeat the enemy using firepower alone. The chief instructor of the British Army School of Musketry at Hyde said it is the aim of infantry to attack with projectiles. No bayonet is in this equation. So bullets alone can now decisively defeat the enemy. You don't need to fix a bayonet. The other enduring legacy of the rifle musket is that the soldiers now have to be trained. We don't think anything now. If a soldier joins the army and said, hey, I saw a recruiter, I joined the army, we think, oh, hey, when do you ship to basic training? Because that's just how things are. It wasn't before the rifle musket. After the rifle musket, soldiers are now armed with weapons that require a great deal of skill and training to use. And the rifle musket influenced the skill and training of the soldier. And the Europeans, when they looked back at the American Civil War, they were horrified. They said, this is how not to fight a war. We don't want to fight a war with large numbers of untrained, enthusiastic volunteer militia, because that means the war goes on and on and on. It's a militia war. And the Europeans, until 1914, were very good about ending their wars very quickly. So the wars of this era, the war, 1859, that was like a 7-week war. There was 2 battles, major battles in the war. The Prussians fought the Danes in 1864. It lasted a year. They fought the Austrians in 1866. It lasted 7 weeks. They fought the French in 1870, beat the French in the field in a matter of weeks. So the Europeans, with these professional trained armies, decisively win in a short order. And they looked at the American Civil War at these enthusiastic armies of volunteers pasting each other for year after year after year, and the battles are not decisive. Like, one side's army always slinks away. Lee always manages to slink away whenever he invades the North. One side isn't able to decisively destroy the enemy's army. So the Europeans look at the American Civil War and think, yeah, the takeaway from the Civil War is teaching us how not to fight a war. But overall and then by 1866, so a year after the American Civil War, the rifle musket's obsolete. We now have breech loaders. The British adopt a center fire breech loading rifle that shoots a normal metallic cartridge. The French adopt a breech loader. The Prussians have a breech loader. Everyone goes to rifles that have a much higher rate of fire, and they shoot much faster, much flatter trajectory. So the rifle musket existed in this 10 to 15 year span that just coincidentally our Civil War happens to fit very neatly into. But I think that is it. Are there any more? Yeah, that was all. I hope that wasn't too soul-crushingly boring, going over the tactics of the French and Europeans and Americans through a tumultuous 15-year period. But if you do have any questions, I don't know how we are on time. I forgot to bring my clock, but I would be very happy if there's time. I'll take as many questions or as few as you have, as long as there's time.